Again, welcome everyone. We're just slowly waiting for everyone to join into the Zoom webinar. And we'll begin in a few moments. With that though, let's begin. Welcome to Courting the AAPI Vote. My name is Nicholas Sung. I am the Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI Research Fellow at the Ash Center. Welcome. Before we kick off this event, 3 quick acknowledgements. The first is a land acknowledgement. The Ash Center, along with the AAPI Caucus, which is a student organization at the Kennedy School, co-sponsoring this event, would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. The second acknowledgement is that this event is being recorded and will be made available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel upon the completion of this event. The third acknowledgement is about question and answers. The event will conclude with a Q&A session, and we encourage audience members to continually submit questions during the event through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom platform. We hope to ask as many of these questions as possible in the final segment of today's event. With those acknowledgements though, I would love to introduce the event as well as welcome our 2 distinguished panelists and our moderator. The 2020 election saw a dramatic increase in AAPI voter participation, increasing 10 percentage points over 2016. And in the run-up to the 2022 midterm elections, we ask, how will political parties continue courting AAPI voters? And so in today's discussion, we'll talk about salient policy issues affecting AAPI communities, data disaggregation and analyzing AAPI voting trends, and political strategies for inspiring AAPI voter participation. And joining us today are 2 distinguished panelists. Madalene Mielke is the president and CEO of Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, or APACS. She brings 25 years of experience working on political campaigns and specializes in political and nonprofit fundraising and political training. Throughout her career, Madalene has collaborated on many campaigns, working with Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Mazie Hirono, Mike Honda, and many, many more. Please note that Madalene is speaking in her personal capacity for today's event. And joining Madalene is Lanhee Chen. Lanhee was raised in Southern California and is the son of Taiwanese immigrants. After earning 4 degrees from Harvard University, he served in senior roles in both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations. He has advised numerous major campaigns, including 4 presidential efforts. Significantly, he was the policy director for the Romney campaign in 2012. He is a professor at Stanford. He is a researcher at the Hoover Institute, and currently he is running for California Controller as the Republican candidate. Welcome, Lanhee and Madalene. And last but not least, our moderator, Tova Wong, is the Senior Practice Fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center. She has 20 years of experience working on improving democracy, including for several years as a Senior Democracy Fellow at Demos. Tova has focused on issues related to greater political inclusion in the United States and is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Politics of Voter Suppression, Defending and Expanding Americans' Right to Vote. Tova, over to you.
So I'm sorry in advance because I have someone doing renovations next door. Of course, this would be the exact moment, so I will be muting myself. First of all, thank you so much, Nick, for inviting me to moderate and for organizing this. I started taking a look at Asian American voter participation, et cetera, probably at least 12 years ago or so. And I was really amazed because they would always refer to the Latinx community as the sleeping giant. And I said to myself, wait a minute, there's another sleeping giant. And that's the Asian American community that even at that time was growing incredibly quickly. And it seems like in 2020, finally, more of the world at least woke up to the power of the Asian American voting electorate. And especially with those increased turnout numbers that Nick was talking about. And again, in anything I say, we all realize that the Asian American community is hardly a monolith, and everyone comes from a number of different countries, but as Nick was saying, the Asian American community has actually been the fastest growing population over the last 20 years, from 10.5 million to 18.9 million during that time. And there's also been a huge increase in voting. Now, way back in the Clinton days, it was pretty evenly split, with even Asian Americans tending towards Republicans. By 2012, with Obama, this had reversed. And since Obama, the Asian American community has been voting overwhelmingly really for Democrats, including for Joe Biden. There was indeed record high turnout in both 2018 and 2020, including in some sort of unexpected states where you don't necessarily think of the Asian American community being all that large, but places like Nevada, North Carolina, Texas, Georgia, Florida, obviously all swing states. And at the same time, a lot of them are registering as independents. So in that sense, we can see that maybe they're more up for grabs than they seem. Of course, there are many issues of importance to the Asian American community. Polling does show that most of them do lean progressive on many of them. But there are also two sort of huge issues that have emerged in the last few years also that we may end up getting into, which are affirmative action, and of course the great increase in violence against Asian Americans as sort of maybe contributing to the political climate. So welcome to our guests with that background. And I'm gonna just ask a couple of questions for you both to answer in whichever order you would like, to sort of get at some of these general trends. So let me start with Madalene. Why do you think Asian American voting is surging as much as it is at this time? I mean, it's been growing, but now it's really increased.
Well, thank you for that question, Tova, and thank you so much to the Ash Center for inviting me to participate with all of you today. With that question, the increase of voters within the AAPI population is something that must be credited to the many nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations that work to register AAPI voters across this country, especially in places where you have states that are with growing populations outside of the coastal states that we tend to think of as California and New York. And so when you think about the many years of work that nonpartisan organizations have put into educating the community in regards to issues or even just the power and influence of voting, we're starting to see the benefits of that now. Many of the population are newer immigrants and new Americans, and so the growth in our population isn't due to birth. It's really due to the fact that there are so many people who are immigrating to this country and becoming new Americans. And so with those lived experiences, people are starting to learn how to vote in a democratic society where, it's a process that, for many Americans, you learn at a young age. And for those individuals who come from countries that don't have voting as a process, it's an educational process in itself to be able to make people aware of what it means to be an active citizen and what it means to be a new American who has the ability to vote. And so, a lot of this in-language discussion is because a third of the AAPI population is not fluent in English. And so, being able to educate them in a way that is in language makes it more comfortable and makes it easier for them to access the ability to vote.
So I heard you saying at the beginning that a lot of the credit goes to sort of grassroots organizations at the state and local level. And is that a new trend also, that these kinds of organizations exist or now have the resources to do that kind of outreach that they didn't before? Especially considering, as you know, that the parties have a very bad record of reaching out to the community.
Yes, I would say for the constituency in itself, I always see my community as being one that's resilient and very independent of wanting to, when they see a challenge, finding solutions themselves and not waiting for others to support them or support us really in a way that we think is meaningful, because a lot of times we've been having this discussion. I started working at the DNC back in the 90s. And so this is an issue that has been ongoing for decades. And so like on a partisan level. So when you start to think about if we're having these types of conversations on a partisan level and not getting the materials that we need and not doing the things that we think are necessary to reach this constituency, other parts of our community will find ways to do that, because we're just not going to wait for others to do it for us. So we do it for ourselves.
So thanks. Lanhee, I would just throw the same thing out to you. What's your take on why now the Asian American voting is really kind of surging in the last few years?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be back at Harvard, at least virtually, and great to have the opportunity to be here and talk about these important issues. I think that fundamentally, there's a couple things going on. First of all, I do think that the issue environment is one where, a lot of Asian American voters and non-voters, people who are coming into the political system, are becoming more aware of the fact that government and politics affect their daily lives in a pretty real way. And whether it's the rise in anti-Asian violence we saw during the pandemic, or issues involving our educational system, or frankly, issues involving small business ownership, the economy, whatever the issues might be, I think there is an increased awareness that what happens in City Hall, what happens in state capitals, and what happens in Washington impacts the lives of Asian American residents and citizens here in the United States. And so I think those are, that's part of the reason why. I do think that the parties traditionally have not done a very good job on either side of really creating a kind of infrastructure to reach and mobilize Asian American voters. I think there probably been some examples of targeted congressional races or particular swing states where there have been more efficacious efforts to engage. But as a general matter, I think it's a fair assessment to say that both parties have left a lot on the table in terms of really speaking out. And then I think this is one area where social media has probably been helpful. I have general qualms about the impact of social media on our politics and democracy. That having been said, I think with respect to communicating within ethnic communities and within the Asian American community, the advent of increased use of social media has certainly been helpful in creating a level of political activation that probably wouldn't have existed before. And so I think a combination of all of those things has made certainly, I mean, the people who I talk to here in California are keenly aware of the fact that politics and policymaking matter, and that there is an influence on people's day-to-day lives that probably wasn't as well recognized, let's say 10 or 15 years ago. So I think it's a combination of all of those different things. Very difficult to pinpoint which one sort of bears the most responsibility or is certainly the most impactful. But regardless of what it is, I think we should be encouraged by the fact that there are more Asian Americans who are taking an active role in trying to influence what happens in our politics and our broader political environment.
You talked about that there's a growing awareness of the impact of government on people's lives as well as social media. And I'm wondering, maybe we can talk about this more later, but is there a generational gap issue, or is there a generational catching up that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's been a very long time since I've done any academic research on this, but when I was doing academic research on this during my time in graduate school, I think the generational question with respect to Asian American political participation was pretty significant. In other words, there were large, they're sort of what was misunderstood about the Asian American community by broader political analysts or political analysts who look at politics more generally were two things. First of all, the ethnic differences in the community and the degree to which ethnic differences really are masked by the broader denomination of Asian American Pacific Islander. It really kind of masks in a lot of ways, I think, some pretty significant ethnic differences. But also the generational question was huge in terms of looking at predictive value with respect to who an Asian American voter was more likely to vote for, what their political views were. The generational differences were significant. And as we see sort of new generations of Asian American voters, Asian Americans become voters, that has a huge influence on the political makeup of the community, as well as the kind of issues that are front and center. So yes, absolutely, I think the generational issues are significant, and as are the questions of sort of ethnic differences as well.
Interesting. Okay. Well, so also for both of you, as I was mentioning earlier, there was a time when actually the community was leaning Republican in the 90s. And over the last 10 or 15 years, that has completely reversed itself to now it being a heavily Democratic constituency with a lot of independents. We understand that that's a part of it. And it's very interesting the way people are also kind of framing Asian American voters as a bloc, which is not as clear. But what do you think that this is now an ongoing trend, that they're going to continue to trend progressive? Where do you see that going now? And starting with Madalene.
Well, I think, in the most recent AAPI vote, AAPI Data, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC 2020 survey, it does highlight that when you do the data disaggregation of the ethnicities within the AAPI constituency, and you break that down, there are certainly ethnic groups that will lean heavily left of center. And then, there will be a few constituencies with a few ethnicities within the constituency that will be right of center. And so some of this is based on multiple generations of those communities being in the United States and having had, experiences, pressure points within history that has highlighted, their experiences as a Japanese American who has gone through internment, and then multiple generations thereafter, being very progressive in the sense of they are very active within politics and understanding the power of voting. So when you think about how people as campaigns position themselves and using rhetoric, in the current political environment where we see a lot of, US versus China, the trade issue, talking about COVID, it's a lot of rhetoric that's going around on both sides that, people take pause and say, hey, we're not going to automatically say that we're a Democrat or a Republican, we will align with our values. However, if you as a Democrat start saying something that we feel is racist or inflammatory to our community, we're going to have to put you on notice. I would say this is, of particular interest right now in the Ohio Senate race, because obviously there are a lot of workers there who see that, there's a heavy influence of China in that race. And so I think this is a part of when you have more active citizens who see the rhetoric that's going around, how is that being used in an inflammatory way? So I say that in the sense that, thinking about each constituency, ethnic group within the constituency, they have different historical interactions with parties and with how they view the political parties are doing in terms of, the issues that they care about. And then adding this other layer of how are you treating us as a community when you're trying to address some of those issues that are on this, bigger world plane.
Can I just ask you for 1 second, because I don't know what you're referring to with respect to the Ohio race? This is the Senate race.
Yes. So Representative Ryan, who is running for Ohio Senate, he had made remarks. I believe it was an ad really targeting, U.S. China and the issues that people were wanted to put him on notice on was basically a language, how he framed the language of that particular situation to where people said, this is going to cause issues within our community, and you are inflaming, the possibility of having more anti-Asian hate because of the language you're using in your ad.
Got it. So Lanhee, same basic question. We've been seeing this trend towards Democrats. Do you think that's something that is lasting, or is that just temporary, and even in terms of your own race in California, how are you kind of navigating that at this point?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that there is a lot more texture, as is the case. Anytime you try and make broad generalizations about a group of voters, you're going to create situations where you find within that group there's always exceptions to the rule. And what I've observed is that there's actually quite a bit of texture within Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in California. And when I talk to people kind of issue by issue and really break down, the question of how they view their political identity, it's a little bit more complex than to say that they're reflexively progressive or reflexively conservative. I think for some voters and for some Asian Americans, absolutely that's the case. I've spoken to some Vietnamese American voters, for example, who are slightly older, and for them, they have a set of issues that they care very deeply about that lead them generally to be more conservative in their leanings in terms of how they participate in politics. And the flip side, I've talked to some younger Chinese American voters for whom a set of issues is more important and significant, and that's going to lead them to tend to vote Democrat more often. So there is this measure of texture that I think is important. And I think if you look at the sort of issue by issue breakdown, what does become clear is that there are some issues that do begin to cut a little bit across traditional partisan lines. So education is one we've talked about. Local control of housing is one in California I found particularly interesting, where you find a lot of Asian American voters are in favor of sort of increased local control, even if that means potentially less housing stock in some local communities because they don't want the essence of their communities to change. I've seen that dynamic play out where you've got voters who have voted Democrat in the last several elections, but now sort of have questions about how that issue cuts into how they think about politics. So I guess I would say that I think the data are the data. And obviously there are an increasing percentage of self-identified Asian Americans who are now registered Democrats and who have voted for Democratic candidates. That having been said, I think the reality on the ground is probably a little bit more complicated than that. And, for example, we look at different demographics within the state. We take a very micro level look at different parts of the electorate in different parts of, for example, LA County, which is the single most populous county in our state. And it would be one thing to say, well, you look at LA County and it seems like it would be like a 70-30 registration advantage for Democrats in the Asian American community. I think that's probably true. But when you really start to dig in on specific communities of interest and specific geographies, you do begin to find a little bit more texture. I guess that's the word I would use.
So are you kind of saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that once you start, if you address the local and maybe state issues and kind of frankly avoid the national perception of the Republican Party right now, that's how you can reach these voters? That sort of you have to get past the national image?
Yeah, I mean, the national politics are challenging. I think, by the way, they're challenging for different reasons. For Democrats and Republicans, the national environment is challenging right now. I'll tell you what I do, which is I talk to people about my own background and how I came to be interested in our political system and what I've done in my life and career and what I've been involved in. And then, I just have a conversation like, what are you concerned about these days? What's bothering you about what's happening in your community and in our state? And, the issues that are identified have a layer of complexity that are, pretty significant. So public safety is another one I hear a lot about, right? I hear from folks saying, listen, I'm concerned about what's happening in big cities and suburbs in California, where it seems like Asian Americans are being targeted for various kinds of crimes. And I say, yeah, that's a big concern of mine too, living here and seeing it happen. And then you start to have a conversation, and what you realize is that people aren't, again, they're not reflexively one way or the other. I do think that I do encounter a fair number of Asian American voters who I speak to who are initially skeptical because they say, hey, look, you're a Republican, like what's up with that, basically. And then we'll have a conversation. I'll say, well, listen, let me tell you why I believe what I believe, and let's talk about what you care about. And then, a third of the way into the conversation, we find that we're 85% aligned on the things we want for our communities and our state. So it's hard, right? Because we got a state of 40 million people. I'm not going to have 40 million conversations. That having been said, the conversations that I do have are remarkably instructive in terms of telling me a little bit about where I think the Asian American community is in California specifically, and where I think there is this opportunity for a little bit more textured understanding of what's happening.
So Madalene, you've heard Lanhee talk about issues, and I guess, all the polling is showing that almost every issue that Asian Americans are leaning Democratic almost on every issue, including actually affirmative action, which has become a hot button issue. So is it just at the national level? Is it when people are voting for president that's the case? Or are you finding that that's where people are?
Well, all politics is local. So I think this is, again, we saw some changes in New York with, the city council, where we had an increase of Asian Americans elected to the city council. I think it's also, of highlight that, there are elected officials who are Republican who were in, previous Democratic districts. Elected in this past election. And part of that was the voter turnout, where Asian Americans came out and decided to vote Republican in those local elections. So I think it's really going to be about how are you addressing those issues on a local level. And then, if there are going to be ticket splitters, because again, this is going to be about how are you directly impacting our lives with the type of legislation or public policy that you're putting forth and proposing as a candidate and moving into as an elected official. So this is, about messaging, a lot of this, going back to law enforcement and feeling, safety or in your own neighborhoods. We've seen this also with the rise of anti-Asian hate and the physical assaults that are happening, where people feel very unsafe in their neighborhoods. This is going to be about how are we protecting our seniors and AAPI women who are also highly targeted. So this is again, messaging that has to happen for both parties to understand, are we doing that? But yet at the same time with some progressive messaging with whether it's defund the police, or how are we talking to law enforcement to where communities feel like they have a say in making those types of decisions with community safety. So there is always going to be a disagreement in terms of what the national conversation is, what this presidential administration is saying it's doing, and what local officials are saying that they're willing to put in place as public policy to make their constituents feel safe. And so when Asian American voters are looking at this, they're looking at a lot of different messaging, and they have to make a decision on who's actually going to make me feel comfortable in my own neighborhood, who makes me feel like I have an opportunity to have a job and improve my economic status. Those are the types of issues that people care about. And if you're not addressing them from the local, from an impactful way, I think some of the challenges that we have with the current administration in regards to Build Back Better is just that no one understands what that means in their local lives. And so if you can't show that, then it's a lot harder to say, this is why you need to re-elect me, or this is why you need to elect me, because this is the direct impact you feel from the work that we're doing in public policy.
And so is that, you've been worked on a lot of Democratic campaigns and so on. Is that sort of the strategy? Is it the needing to connect the dots strategy? And having said that the parties have not done a good job of outreach, is that changing for the Democratic Party, having seen where they're at? And so is there also a mobilization strategy happening?
Each of the national committees have an outreach plan. I know that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is making a substantial investment in looking at constituencies of color to build a coalition for the midterm elections. And so when you think about that in regards to the Asian American outreach, we are interested in being sure that there are people who are have access to in-language materials, that they are translating materials in a competent way. Culturally, competency is important for us when it comes to making sure that we have organizers who can communicate with our different constituencies. So, those are sort of the things that we think about in terms of, are you meeting the voters in the way they need to be met? Going to ethnic media, looking at disinformation and misinformation and addressing those challenges as well. That might also be happening in language. And so, as trusted messengers who are talking to our communities, how are the messages that campaigns are using, in language transferable to a community that is a third not fluent in English? And so you have to be able to look at the different constituencies that are in a district and say, this is what I have, this is what I think I need in terms of making sure that we're communicating and not writing off like only in language materials, and having organizers who can actually communicate with the various constituencies.
So, I mean, you talked about in language and, of course, in terms of the voting process, there are some places where it's required for the voting process to be in language. Just as a quick sort of maybe aside even, is there also concern, or are people addressing some of the voter access, voting restriction issues that have come up? Is that also having to factor into the strategy the way it is in some of the other communities that we see?
I see it as it's, protecting the vote, making sure that there are election protection vehicles in place to be able to make sure that we're addressing those as it comes. But also, if anyone is unable to exercise their right to vote, that, a lot of our nonpartisan colleagues out there are just making sure that people can exercise their right to vote and, have a hotline to be able to communicate that. So I feel that in regards to voting rights, it's so important for us to educate the community with what is the existing law. Like, if you have to provide an ID, the times that you are allowed to vote, mail-in ballots, absentee balloting, whatever it is that is the current law, that those things are enforced so that people are able to feel confident that they are able to exercise their right to vote.
So kind of the same thing, Lanhee, so at the national level, do you see the party having a particular strategy around appealing to Asian American voters? Maybe as you said, it's very different by different countries of origin and so on. But do you see a stepped up effort to do that outreach and do that mobilization work?
Yeah, I mean, I think at various points over the last couple of years, there have been, there's certainly been a plan. I think there's been a thought process that's gone into, okay, how do National Republican Party entities, whether it's the RNC or the National Republican Congressional Committee or the National Republican Senatorial Committee, how do they communicate with and message to Asian American Pacific Islander voters, and do so in language where appropriate? I think what it ends up coming down to, at least more recently, is targeted efforts in particular congressional districts or areas, for example, where there is a belief that outreach and that connection can move the needle. And I think you see it, for example, I mean, just to use another California example, because that's where I am, in Orange County, the Republican Party has placed a number of offices in communities where they believe that there are Asian American voters who would be open to the message that Republican candidates, usually at the congressional level, have. And you saw that kind of plan come to fruition in some ways with the election of 2 Korean American members of Congress from Orange County in 2020. And then now both of those members of Congress are running for re-election, and the Republican Party is kind of engaging in the same kind of institutional creation of infrastructure that will help to mobilize voters and get a message across in those targeted areas. But from what I've observed, it's less of a truly national effort. I mean, I think both parties want to make it sound like a truly national effort, but in reality, there's a little bit of targeting that has to go on here. in terms of figuring out what communities is the message going to be most well received in, and where do you invest the resources and energy to try and move the needle on the percentage of population that you need in order for that to have an impact on the election. And I think that in practical reality is what I've seen go on more often.
Really interesting. Okay, well, so now is the time that if you have a question to put it in the Q&A box, and because we're going to be moving to Q&A from the audience now. And for that, I'm going to turn it back to Nick, who has been taking the questions. And also we had a lot of questions that were submitted before today, so we'll be talking about some of that too.
Thank you, Tova. And yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions before the event, and I can see that they're coming in right now. But one thing that seems to be touched upon in a through line for the questions being submitted before and after is, Madalene, you mentioned a couple of times that a third of AAPI voters are not fluent in English, and touching upon translations. And so Mona from Vote Riders has asked, how do you assess Democrats and Republicans' success at translating voting documents and campaign material? And maybe after Madalene, you answer that, Lanhee, we can ask you specifically, how are you translating campaign material and thinking for your specific race about translating to better reach and mobilize AAPI voters in California?
Well, thank you for that question. A lot of times, like I said earlier, communities have just done it themselves. Like they will find fluent speakers who are creating materials from English materials and then translating themselves, who are native speakers. Now, people should get paid for their work. So I've seen the Democratic Party say, okay, we're going to have official translators now who will now create these materials for us, and communities themselves will not have to on their own. And so, there is an investment in that. They have started to see that there is a need for it. They understand that, every vote counts, and to be able to do that, micro-targeting that in the voter file for being able to understand that there are voters who need in-language access, and really providing the resources to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, one of the big themes that I stress with my campaign team and with people who I work with is that we have to really meet people where they are. And if in many cases that will mean we will be communicating with voters in non-English languages. And so we have a very specific plan in place to make sure that we're communicating with voters in the language that they're most comfortable getting communication in. And by the way, for the majority of Asian American voters, that will be in English. However, we are certainly aware of the fact that the Chinese community, the Korean community, the Vietnamese community, which are probably the three largest in my state, those are the ones where we really want to make sure that we are communicating effectively in language as well. And that means not just the translation of campaign materials, but ensuring that that is happening in a way that is consistent with how people who speak that native language consume the information, right? This is not something where you can kind of airdrop in somebody else and say, okay, well, just translate this and just translate it the best you can and go with the message. You really have to get feedback from the community and say, is this message really conveying what I think it's trying to convey? And that's really important to me because I think words do matter in politics. And so making sure that you're understanding whatever it is you're saying is landing and being conveyed in the right way. I think that's another challenge, frankly, too. But absolutely, making sure that you are conveying what you're trying to convey. And the other thing is, in California, as a candidate, you actually have to fill out a form to express what you want the transliteration of your name into a foreign language to be. So, lest they try to make up a Chinese name for me, I actually have to fill out a form that says, this is my Chinese name, please use this. This is how people will refer to me and how I will refer to myself in the Chinese language media. So there are these extra steps that some states have that you have to make sure you take so that there's consistency in your brand and your message across languages, but that's something that we're certainly paying very close attention to.
That's something that is definitely a topic of conversation at the Kennedy School among students too, name pronunciation, sequencing, as well as I think that it touches upon the cultural competencies that Madalene was also talking about before. We have another question from Mabel that was pre-submitted, and it relates to Lanhee and Tova. You talked about the kind of generational breakdown that exists within AAPI communities by age, and especially in relationship to social media. But Mabel asked a question kind of beyond age also, what are the other demographic identities within AAPI communities by religion, gender, immigration, status, et cetera, that are important, but maybe underexplored by political parties? And for this, maybe we can go in reverse, Lanhee, and then back to Madalene.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the question of recency of arrival to the United States is an important one that, you know, I think even more than age probably determines, not determines, but has an influence on one's political perspective. So we find that immigrants who are more recently part of the American culture and American fabric have one perspective versus people who have been here for generations. And that tends to be something that I think is a meaningful distinction. And, you know, there are others as well. You mentioned faith background. Certainly, you know, faith background is something that maps over politics in, you know, recently, I think it's become a little bit more complex, but nonetheless, I think that the faith background is something that we certainly look at in our identification of voters as well, in terms of trying to determine, you know, how are we making sure that we're conveying the messages about my campaign and what I'm trying to do as well. So a number of those you mentioned are important, but the one I would really highlight is this question of how recent the person, the voter, has sort of arrived in the United States.
I would certainly agree with that. And then I also would add to it that, you know, for a lot of any constituency, you know, the ability to be intersectional, you know, being, you know, your gender, plus also, you know, the issues and values that you are, that you find are most in alignment to your own personal values. You know, those are sort of the things that sort of make up, you know, these individual now voters. When you start to think about the time and resources it takes to do the research to find the right message for every voter. And so again, this idea of any sort of constituency being a monolith is a lot harder to build that generalization of a campaign message. And so the more time you spend getting to know the voters and what they care about, that's where that intersectionality really hits, because it's not just you being a certain constituency, but you care about certain issues. And the more you layer that, the better you have an outcome in terms of creating a message that's more micro targeted to that, you know, voting population.
I think that relates to what you were saying before, also about all politics is local. We have another question here that touches upon a conversation we actually had a year ago with the Ash Center related to misinformation and disinformation within AAPI communities, as well as the Latinx community. And so Janelle asks, are either of you aware of particularly effective efforts to combat misinformation targeting AAPI voters proliferating on social media? Maybe to that, I could also add Kakao Talk, as well as on WeChat, et cetera, et cetera. And if so, please describe. And if not, how large of a problem do you believe that this targeted misinformation, disinformation to actually be? Madalene, maybe I can kick it to you and then bounce it to Lanhee.
I do know that the national campaigns are, the committees themselves have created departments just to recognize this as a challenge. They see it as something they need to address from previous elections. And so they are taking steps to be able to, and that also includes, you know, all of the different app platforms that are in language that could, you know, again, going back to not just the translation, this is all about cultural competency, being able to use that in a way that they can combat some of that disinformation, misinformation. And so I know that that in itself is of particular interest to each of the national committees.
I mean, it's hugely challenging given, you know, how many different social media platforms there are, and there's so much, you know, peer-to-peer communication going on. There's peer-to-group, group-to, I mean, it's hard to, you know, to track it all down, frankly, because you're and then the other thing is different communities are going to reside in different social media universes, right? So there is a group of voters that is really only reachable by WeChat. there's a group of voters that's really only reachable via line in the Taiwanese American community, for example. There's a group that's only reachable via Kakao, primarily in the Korean American community. So you have to, I mean, from a campaign perspective, you do your best to ensure you have resources that you're deploying to convey message that's your message. But in terms of identifying misinformation, that's something, you know, at least as I see it, you have to rely on people in those platforms to really identify those things. So it's hard to have a systematic effort when the information proliferates so quickly. And when there's so many nodes of activity across different kinds of social media platforms, it's tremendously difficult, I think, to have a systematic effort underway, because it's not just about, let's say, certain Facebook channels or certain things on YouTube. The number of networks is staggering when you start to think about it. So I don't know of a systematic effort that's underway beyond sort of broader efforts to counter misinformation. I would just say that it's really, really hard when you really start to get into how much campaigning is going on each of these different networks and how much message is being distributed on a daily or hourly basis. It's very, very difficult to counter it in any kind of systematic way.
Thank you for those in-depth responses. I would agree. I feel like it's quite difficult to kind of think on your toes and to react in the moment. Interestingly, I feel like you kept on bringing up Line and the Taiwanese American community. Maybe there's also lessons that can be learned too from Taiwan itself in how they manage misinformation and disinformation potentially coming from mainland in their elections. We have another question from Richard, who is part of AAPI Caucus at the Kennedy School, and kind of back to you, Lanhee, to talk a little bit more maybe about the differences between newly arrived immigrants and those AAPI citizens who have been in the United States for a longer period of time. Are these differences consistent across ethnic groups, and what exactly are those general differences? So maybe I can kick it to Lanhee, and then Madalene, if you'd like to follow up on that too.
Yeah, in terms of differences across ethnicity, you know, I think there's certainly, you have to look at how ethnicity intersects with some of these other factors as well. But I'll just say that in terms of the specific issues that, you know, I have found, for example, that there are particular concerns about quality of school system, for example, that a lot of, and by the way, this is not just recently arrived. I think all people should be concerned about the quality of their local school system. That having been said, I hear a particular set of concerns around what is the school system doing to prepare my student, my child, to succeed at the university level and beyond. Those specific questions I hear, you know, pretty frequently from more recently arrived members of the Asian American community. Certainly with respect to public safety issues, that is something that I hear actually that I think cuts across, because it's an issue of salience for people who've just arrived here. But then for people who've been here for longer, many of them observe that communities are different now, right? The safety and security they once felt is not something they feel anymore. So that's one that kind of cuts across. But there definitely are, I think in education and economic issues in particular, those are the two categories where I will observe that more recently arrived immigrants have more particular concerns about what's going on in their communities, what's happening in our state. And I hear more frequently about those issues when I speak to people who have more recently arrived.
So jobs in the economy are, you know, they were the big issues after 2020 and during the 2020 election. So this economy has changed so much due to all the challenges we faced during the pandemic, that I think it still is the number one issue, especially now when you think about how the job market has changed so much for people who are employers as well as employees. And so if you are coming to this country looking for opportunity, because this is the country that everyone would say, please come here and you will be able to build your own career, this is definitely something that newer Americans are looking at in terms of how are they providing economic security. So, you know, I think those people, those voters who have been in this country for that, you know, multi-generational piece, I think that's also a part of the historic nature of also being in this country and seeing how you are a part of the American history. And I think that's something that we lack also in terms of the curriculum and talking about how Asian Americans have also built this country. And so, that, gap in between someone who's been here for multiple generations and someone who is newly arrived is that, educational awareness of where we might be in terms of, as a constituency, this is how we've grown, this is how we've become more influential in the outcomes that we see in public policy.
That was very helpful. And you touched upon also jobs for the 2020 election. And I think that leads into one final question that's coming from the Q&A related to someone who ran as a candidate and talked a lot about jobs, especially jobs in the fourth industrial revolution. And of course, what is a conversation maybe for according to AAPI vote without touching upon Andrew Yang. And so Cheryl asks, could you please shed light on AAPI citizens and voters' attitudes towards AAPI candidates, especially ones on the national stage like Andrew Yang? It seems that AAPI communities usually support their own candidates to increase representation. Do you find that this is true? And how do you think about not only Andrew Yang's run in the national level on the presidential stage, but also in New York, specifically kind of related to some of the controversy that maybe he got into related to his Washington Post op-ed calling for Asian Americans to show their true Americanness. And so Madalene, maybe I can kick that to you and bounce it to Lanhee.
Well, I just want to remind individuals that we had also Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. We also had Senator Kamala Harris, who is now our vice president. And so, with 3 Asian Americans on the national platform running for president, I think that really elevated the community. And so, in the sense of also recognizing history, having Patsy Mink be the first, in running for president, I think this is, strides that we've made in showing this country that we are all qualified to run for president, as long as we meet our, the prerequisites for the office. And I think this is also one of those things that last year, we also had 3 mayors who are in top 100 cities who were elected. We have Seattle, Cincinnati, and Boston. So this is not just a story of, Andrew Yang and his run, but also how Asian Americans are stepping forth and making it normal for us as a constituency to be seen as leaders in this country, regardless of whether or not there are Asian Americans in your district. And so, with a growing population as the fastest demographic, we have every right to be able to step forward and say we can represent our districts, whether it's as a mayor, whether it's as a city council member, or as president, because we're all active citizens who just want to make public policy that will benefit everyone. So, I think, anyone who wants to run, and, in my day job, working at APEX, I say anyone who wants to run for public office anywhere and is legally qualified to do so should feel that they have the ability to do so. And that is a part of, being an active citizen in this country. And as an Asian American, that identity has helped to build this country.
Yeah, I say to people when I talk to them about my own background and, what I'd like to do for the state, don't just support me because I'm Asian American. Don't just support me because I'm a Republican when I'm talking to Republicans. Support me because we're aligned on the kind of leadership that you think the state needs and the kinds of issues that you think I'll address. And I think that's very important, because your question was, well, this notion that, well, you got an Asian candidate, so you can expect Asian American support. And the answer is, I think, again, it's a little more complicated than that. I think that there's a level of political maturity that we're seeing in more and more Asian American voters who say, listen, I want to know, what do you stand for? What are you going to do? Right? It's not as simple as, hey, this person shares an ethnic background or shares a racial background with me, I'm going to support them. And so I do think that it's a little bit more complicated than that. I actually have a good deal of admiration for what Andrew did and his continuing role in kind of speaking out on issues and being involved in politics. And I think that in a lot of ways, the more that can happen to kind of create this notion that, listen, we are just as much a part of the fabric of this country and have just as much of a right and an ability to participate in our politics at every level. I don't care if it's running for mayor or running for president. The notion that there is belonging and that there is an opportunity for participation, I think, is very, very important. And so I credit people, regardless of party, who've made the effort to step forward and to do it. And I think the more that we can come together and truly mean it when we say we want broadly people in the community to be able to participate in our politics at all levels, I think is a useful thing. So now as a candidate, I can tell you that, there are parts about it that are challenging for sure. And so I can understand why not everyone would want to do it. But I encourage, students of mine, friends of mine, people who are in my networks, hey, if you want to do it, you should do it, because you learn a lot about yourself and you learn a lot about our state and our country by doing it. And I think ultimately we'll be better for it as a community.
It's brilliant, and maybe an inspiring note to end the Q&A session on. Tova, back to you.
That was great. Of course, the questions for the audience were the best ones. That was super interesting. I'll just say that I think we probably can agree that this is a community that is going to continue to grow and grow in terms of political power, and probably will see more people running for office as well, even given how difficult that can be. So I just want to allow each of you to make whatever closing remarks or say anything about anything that you didn't get a chance to before. So Lanhee, I'll turn first to you.
Well, look, I'm cognizant this is not a campaign event, so I'm not going to talk about my campaign, but I will just say that I'm encouraged that we're having this conversation at this point in time. And I'm encouraged to see so many Asian American and Pacific Islander voters that I interact with here in California and beyond, who really care deeply about what's happening in our state and our country. And I hope we see more of it. I hope we see record turnout. I hope we see many more people getting involved in the process at all levels, because I think that is an important and essential part of how we can continue to gain voice and perspective in our political system. And so I'm glad we had a chance to talk about this today. I'm glad we're doing it even before Asian American Heritage Month, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. But I'm glad to be here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. And, I think it's so important for our community to participate just in everyday ways of, your town halls, you're going to, ANC commissions, going to, things that really show how our communities are built. And the more we make it such a normal facet of life and seeing Asian Americans in these spaces, it just makes the whole idea of an Asian American being an elected leader even that more common. So when it comes to our parties discussing community outreach and investment, I think it's really important that we remind them, internally with the people who work in these committees, externally with the people who are, community leaders, making each of our parties understand that this investment needs to be real. It has to be a long-term one, and it can't be expected that you will see results if you come in a month before the election. So I believe very dearly that this community has the ability to influence elections, because we can be the margin of victory, and it is up to us to make sure that we bring awareness to our voters about elections. And it's the party's jobs to figure out how do you get people aligned with your values, and you do it in a way that's culturally competent, and in a way that tells this community that you actually care about the outcomes. So thank you for this opportunity, and I hope to continue this conversation in the future.
Okay, well, this is when I thank you both so much on behalf of the Ash Center and our other co-sponsors. And thanks again to Nick Sung for really being the force behind this. And thanks to the audience. The recording of this will be on the Ash Center YouTube channel if you want to watch it or share it with anybody else. And look out for future events of the Ash Center on our website.